Back in 1989, it really felt like history just hit the fast-forward button. The Berlin Wall came down, and with it, this entire economic and political world order just vanished. But what happened next? For hundreds of millions of people, the end of communism wasn't just about political freedom. It was the start of one of the most sudden and painful economic shocks in modern history. So let's dive into what that transformation really looked like.
The book that this explainer is based on opens with this incredibly powerful dedication. And it's a perfect reminder that behind all the huge economic data points and the geopolitical maps, this is a story about real people, about individual lives and families just trying to get by through wave after wave of radical change. It really grounds this massive story in a deeply personal reality.
The best way to think about this whole period really is like a massive earthquake. That's the metaphor the source material uses, and it's spot on. The political ground itself was literally shifting under everyone's feet. But today, we're going to explore the huge economic aftershocks that followed, the tremors that completely reshaped the lives of an entire generation.
All right, so let's set the scene here. The year is 1989. The world is standing on the edge of a completely massive and totally unprecedented transformation. So, picture this. It's June of that year. You've got communist regimes across Europe and the Soviet Union ruling over 420 million people. I mean, that's about 9% of the entire world's population at the time, all living inside this single, state-controlled economic system that was, well, about to shatter into a million pieces. Okay, so to really get a handle on the shock of what came next, we first have to understand the world that was being replaced. What was the economic reality of day-to-day life under communism? Well, it all revolved around something we can call the socialist bargain.
And this table, wow, it really shows you just how total the state's control was. On average, 90% of the workforce was employed by the state. In a place like Czechoslovakia, it was almost 99%. So the state wasn't just an employer. For pretty much everyone, it was the only employer. It controlled your job, your wages, your pension, the whole shebang.
So this system offered this kind of unique bargain. On one hand, you had a guaranteed job for life. Your wages were low, yeah, but they were also super equal. Pensions weren't really savings, they were just seen as your state income continuing after you retired. And you got all these universal social benefits. But the trade-off? The state controlled basically every part of your economic life, and building up any kind of private wealth was next to impossible. It was a world of incredible stability for sure, but also immense restriction.
And then, boom. Almost overnight, that entire world just broke apart. The period that followed wasn't just one revolution, it was like a series of simultaneous revolutions, happening not just in politics, but in the economy too.
See, it wasn't just a political revolution. Something else happened too, a revolution in information. For the very first time, researchers and the public could actually see reliable data on things like income and poverty. This was stuff that had been treated like a state secret for 70 years. As the old system fell apart, a new, much clearer, and often much harsher picture of reality started to come into focus.
And the political chaos, it was off the charts. The Soviet Union, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, these three huge federations, they just disintegrated, creating 22 brand new countries in their place. The map of Europe was being redrawn at this dizzying, incredible speed.
And as these political maps were being redrawn, a totally new and frankly terrifying economic reality started to sink in: unemployment. In the old system, the very idea of unemployment didn't really exist, but now it just exploded. For millions, the absolute core of that socialist bargain, a guaranteed job, was suddenly gone.
It's really hard to wrap your head around the scale of this collapse. The source material draws a direct line to the economic turmoil that followed the world wars. And for many of these new countries, the depression they went through was even deeper and more prolonged than the Great Depression was in the United States. Think about that for a second.
Okay, so this brings us right to the heart of the story, right? The incredible human cost of all this disruption. Because as incomes plummeted and unemployment skyrocketed, poverty just exploded on a scale you rarely see in peacetime.
So really, what was the human price tag on this economic earthquake? How many people were actually left behind in all this change?
All right, let's look at the numbers. Back in 1989, right as this was all kicking off, you had about 14 million people across the entire region living in poverty, and we're defining that here as living on less than $4 a day.
But by the mid-1990s, that number wasn't 14 million anymore. It was 140 million. Just let that sink in, a 10-fold increase.
This wasn't some slow, gradual change. It was a sudden, massive wave of hardship that just completely overwhelmed these societies.
So you might be asking, how could this happen so fast? Well, the old social safety nets, they just weren't built for this. They were designed for a world with zero unemployment and total state control. Benefits like child allowances were universal, which meant they weren't targeted at the people who needed them the most. The system just wasn't equipped to handle things like market-based poverty and mass joblessness.
So what was left when the dust settled? What kind of world emerged from all this chaos? Well, it was a new and fundamentally different world with a legacy that we're still seeing today.
And this comparison here, it's just so stark, isn't it? Before, you had state-dominated everything, low inequality, and guaranteed jobs. Afterwards, you see the rise of the private sector, but along with it, skyrocketing inequality and, of course, unemployment. The old social benefits either shrank or just became way less effective at helping the poorest people. The entire economic DNA of society was rewritten from scratch.
And really, that's the big takeaway here. The construction of capitalism, as the source calls it, was in many ways a success. Functioning market economies did emerge from the rubble. But the process itself, this shock therapy, this rapid unraveling of the old ways, it came at an absolutely enormous social cost, leaving behind these deep scars of inequality and social disruption.
And all of this leaves us with a pretty heavy question, doesn't it? This historic transformation successfully built new economies and new societies. But when you look back at the human cost, that tenfold explosion in poverty, you have to ask, what was the true price of that change? And is that price still being paid today?